when we were brainstorming about this webinar today, we felt it could be interesting to show you different levels of marine spatial planning, ocean governance, and I think it fits very well after this impressive academic effort that César highlighted, focusing on charismatic and economically important species, to look at it from a national perspective and to see how national marine spatial planning provides very important building blocks, so to say, bottom up for transboundary and broad regional conservation planning. We found ourselves in a situation very similar to the situation that César described about 15 years ago. We saw in the Western Pacific, Pacific Island countries exploring ways to expand as sustainable blue economies. Many of the countries we were working with in the Western Pacific were, of course, on one hand, aiming to reach their priority national and global development goals. At the same time, they relied very, very strongly on specific and for a long time important traditional economic sectors, such as, for example, the fishery for tuna. At the same time, these countries wanted to diversify their income sources, and they looked at other sectors. While coastal development took place, populations increased, shipping became increasingly important, container harbors were growing to provide Pacific Island communities with goods and services. Tourism broadened, countries scaled up their tourism efforts. And at the same time, countries had strong national commitments towards biodiversity conservation and wanted to increase their terrestrial and marine conservation measures. At the same time, some additional sectors that were not much recognized before were increasingly also appearing on the national level, and I'm referring here especially to deep sea minerals and the potential future mining efforts for deep sea minerals. So that was the introduction, basically, 15 years ago to marine spatial planning efforts in 5 Pacific Island countries. What was the problem at the time? We saw that with this situation that I just described, countries were struggling to address and mitigate the conflicts that arose from these different sectors, trying to maximize income sources from a national perspective. And while the countries in the Pacific are strong leaders globally when it comes to sustainable blue economic development, these conflicts became increasingly obvious. And the question was how to balance the, on one hand, ecological and conservation needs of the countries with the economic and the social needs on the other hand, while not giving in to current pressures of individual sectors, but really taking into account the needs of future generations. And those were discussions that took place in 2011, 2012, 2013. And the idea was to seek funding for a broader approach involving several Pacific Island countries in an effort to recognize marine ecosystem service values that also César highlighted in his presentation, to show and make visible some of the often invisible values that these ecosystems, goods and services have. And also, and that is the theme today of our session, to broaden the geographic scope. Because you might remember at the same time, the CBD Secretariat in Montreal initiated the first regional EPSA workshops, inviting colleagues from the different countries to come together to identify ecologically and biologically significant areas in the high seas. But while we attended this first global workshop for the in the Western Pacific for EPSAs, the representatives from the countries highlighted that in order to provide the kind of information and data that César just provided for the Eastern Pacific, they were feeling that they were at that stage still lacking information and data in regard to their national territorial seas and their exclusive economic zones. So in that situation, I stop. This is actually also a good moment to highlight an often perceived misconception. I think Olivier very eloquently highlighted, and also Khalid, and again César, I think with his third or fourth approach, the importance of climate change. But with this graph from the WWF Living Planet Index, it is really important to acknowledge that when we look at global vertebrate wildlife loss on a global scale, the vast majority, the two different green parts of the pie chart, is basically loss due to exploitation, overexploitation, and habitat degradation, or with the yellow pie element, habitat loss. While the blue element here is the important area of climate change that concerns us a lot, but that should not lead to a situation in which we underestimate the impact of exploitation, habitat degradation, and habitat loss. So in that regard, the decision was made to work with 5 Pacific Island countries: Fiji, Kiribati, Solomon Islands, Tonga, and Vanuatu. The Secretariat of the Pacific Regional Environment Programme, or SPREP, was the key regional stakeholder. IUCN, with a regional office in Suva, Fiji, had a very key role through its membership structure and the contributions from IUCN member states, IUCN member commissions, and also IUCN member institutions and NGOs. And from the GIZ side, we facilitated the process through technical contributions in the 5 countries over a time period of 5 years. The funding at the time, like now for SOMACORE, was also provided by the International Climate Initiative that is currently coordinated in Germany by the German Federal Ministry of Environment. And how did the stakeholders of these 5 governments and the supporting partners approach the situation? We felt at the time, especially after the EPSA discussions and recognizing the lack of information on many important marine ecosystem services, that the first task should be to better document the presence and values of marine ecosystem services. And I think César's talk also very nicely underlined how important scientific data are and how important it is to make them accessible, because to have this information just in the peer-reviewed literature is not enough. The question really was also how to give wider access to this kind of information, not only to colleagues within the departments of fishery or within the Department of Environment, but really to broader parts of the national civil society and the different government sectors. At the same time, intending to talk about marine spatial planning, it became also clear that we would have to provide the government colleagues with means to create stronger incentives for these different sectors to listen to each other and to work together. We took note of the different situations in the countries, and we supported the governments in adapting guidelines for integrated marine spatial planning, and on different scales. And that's what the graphic on the right highlights. So within those 5 countries, we worked with government, NGO, and local community, indigenous people, stakeholders on the community scale, looking from a local managed marine area perspective at tambu areas in which local communities closed fisheries, either for a certain time period or for longer periods, terrestrial protected areas, their interaction with each other, fisheries management in that context, other forms of management, for example, restriction of certain gears, and also the identification of potential no-take zones. And that is actually a very common approach that we find as a stepping stone towards many smaller marine protected areas in many of the countries in the region and also globally. The next step becomes more tricky, and that is the level of marine spatial planning scaled up to the national level. For the last 15-20 years, we have been speaking a lot about ridge to reef management and ridge to reef planning. And we felt 15 years ago that we had to go beyond. It should not just be ridge to reef, it should be hills to ocean. And saying ocean, it should really be to the 200 nautical mile exclusive economic zone limit. And in that regard, the question for the countries was, what is the current situation? What is the degree of shipping traffic? What are the trends? Where are these pelagic fisheries priority areas that Cesar just highlighted from their national perspective? At the same time, it was not quite clear how among those countries, their existing policies, their existing laws were already providing all tools and instruments, or whether there were still gaps when it came to broader integrated marine spatial planning. At the same time, working with different GIS users and practitioners in the region, it became also clear that different government agencies and also regional agencies highlighted the need to improve access to spatial data. And there was a problem that on one hand, there are fantastic tools, S3, ArcGIS, for example, as a software, but it's an expensive software solution. And so we said, whatever solution there should be, it should be ideally open source and license free. And so we worked with a lot of stakeholders, regional university, government stakeholders, private sector, researchers from the region on potential resources, very similar to the approach that Cesar just described. And the idea was really, as so often, to collect the information, to provide this neutral, objective information to the stakeholders to foster truly intersectoral decision-making processes on the national level among the national stakeholders. And I underline that because very often, especially in the conservation community, we can be perceived as bullies if we come in with very strong conservation values and conservation paradigms, while other national stakeholders, of course, have their sectoral priorities and perspectives and want to be taken, of course, serious in that regard. In the end of the day, the question was in how far effective management that exists and existed already at the time in these 5 countries could be replicated. And so starting with the Marine and Coastal Ecosystem Services, we worked in all 5 countries with different government agencies, and we looked at Marine and Coastal Ecosystem Services. Here, an example from Vanuatu. With the fisheries colleagues, we looked at commercial fishery values, subsistence fishery data. In some countries, coastal aggregate mining was already an important factor, while deep sea minerals were just being explored, but not yet exploited. Tourism and recreation was a growing factor, very important in some countries, as we will see. Protection against coastal floods cannot be underestimated in regard to its importance. Carbon sequestration at the time, as you can imagine, 15 years ago, not many people were talking about blue carbon at the time, was still underestimated. But we were before the UN decade of ocean science, so research and education and the prospect of bioprospection were also differently perceived in the different countries we worked with. And one element that we did not try to monetize, but that is very important in this context, are the cultural values. That different members of society, the local communities, the indigenous people, of course, assign to different coastal and marine and also terrestrial ecosystem elements, services, and goods. So while I think the maps that Cesar produced speak for themselves when you present them to the scientific community, we were aware that whatever we wanted to produce, if it would be a 120-page report, might not be read by everybody. So we did not only produce national reports and knowledge products, but we also invested time to look with colleagues in the countries at the types of infographics that they would find useful in the country to highlight the values that we were talking about. And we explored a little bit in how far an animated video or documentary also helped to share the message. Those of you who are interested, we will have PDFs of the presentations. Those studies that are highlighted here on the right side are on the internet. There's a MacBio webpage. If you Google MacBio, you come to the webpage and then you just look under resources and you find the different products that the colleagues in our 5 countries produced over those years. What was interesting to note, and this is very much about lessons learned today, when we started in 2011, 2012, and you asked 10 different people about what they thought marine spatial planning was, you heard 10 different answers. Marine spatial planning was still relatively young. With UNESCO, there was an effort in 2008, 2009 to bring practitioners to the table. Charles Ehlers was strongly involved, and Fanny Duvert. And through that process, we felt there was a good definition. And for that reason, I still bring it up, because I still see a trend that new stakeholders tend to redefine marine spatial planning. So at that time, 2008, 2009, 2010, I think there was growing agreement that marine spatial planning should be seen as an integrated and participatory planning process and tool, clearly meant to balance ecological, economic, and social objectives, and aiming for sustainable marine resource use for the time to come, and ultimately prosperous blue economies. The problem that we saw, and the reason why I put in the slide, although many of you are familiar with this definition, is that sometimes if you work for a conservation NGO, I trust that you will have been accused that we used marine spatial planning as a tool for conservation planning, as a tool to delineate marine protected areas. And that was sometimes the moment when the fisheries colleagues walked out, or other important stakeholders felt that there was one sector with a strong sectoral agenda trying to dominate the process. And that should definitely not be the case, because it should be truly integrated. Looking at the efforts, very similar again to Cesar, many workshops, sessions, consultations, many layers of data that were compiled for each of the 5 countries, long-lasting national policy reviews in regard to the question how different government ministries and sectors relate to marine biodiversity. What kind of tools does the fisheries ministry have? What kind of tools are there under a ministry for indigenous priorities and resources? What kind of legal basis do we have in the 5 countries that we worked with when it comes to, on one hand, delineating certain forms of marine coastal management, and also how to identify the objectives of these delineated areas. So what is meant here by typology and prioritization workshops was the situation that we found that many of the countries had not only 4, 5, 6, 7 different types of marine conserved, marine protected areas, fisheries reserves. Often we found ourselves in a situation where we found 15, 20, 25, even 30 different ways and forms to delineate marine areas, depending on the sector, on the sectoral perspective. Interesting parallel to Cesar's work as well, we felt and realized that a lot of the basic information, and Cesar highlighted oceanographic data, he highlighted the knowledge on charismatic or economically important species, were not widely accessible. And so we worked with the countries to develop a national atlas for each of the countries that had geographic aspects, that had oceanographic aspects, biological aspects, chemical aspects, and that became a very helpful tool. At the same time, the countries are in a different situation than, for example, Colombia, Costa Rica, or Peru, in the sense that in Pacific Island countries, we have small populations, we have not many universities and academic experts. So the question was in how far the limited human capacity of the governments that we worked with could benefit most from the spatial data and the other data that were compiled. And at the same time, what also became very, very clear is that it's not sufficient to carry out marine spatial planning top-down and to declare the outcome top-down. So we spend a lot of time actually in the 5 countries to work on the subnational level to have provincial consultations on draft policies, draft plans, draft marine resource use suggestions. And I feel in hindsight that that really made a difference. This is how it looked like for the Solomon Islands, for example, which are one of the current 6 SOMACORE countries. On the left, an example for the infographics that were developed, sort of catchy, short, bite-sized facts and figures. Tourism value, 119 million Solomon Island dollars per year. The value of coastal protection that previously was not known. The value of carbon sequestration that previously was not known. The value of the subsistence fishery, 75 million per year, that was heavily underestimated before we worked with the colleagues in fisheries to compile these data. And that in turn led to the integrated spatial planning that is reflected by the map in the middle. Colleagues in the Solomon Islands were surprised about the complexity that this map highlights, because colleagues just looking from a fisheries perspective, just looking from a tourism perspective, underestimated the other elements that also had important impact on the marine ecosystem goods and services and the species that we all care about. At the same time, I think with the marine spatial planning and with the economic data, the government had very good and efficient tools to highlight existing good and effective management examples and to work on replicating and upscaling these examples. And on the right side, the Arnhem Community Marine Conservation Area, that was the first gazetted marine protected area in the Solomon Islands. And since then, many other areas in the Solomons and in the neighboring countries are following the example. And something that could not be predicted, but that was definitely something that was a major breakthrough. Many of the countries, based on the marine spatial planning efforts, recognized the need for an intersectoral committee, commission, government mechanism for consistent, ongoing intersectoral exchange. And here in the Solomon Islands, for example, it was called the Ocean 12 different ministries that regularly meet and that basically advise each other and that carry out joint decision-making when it comes to marine spatial planning for the Solomon Islands. So what were the challenges? It turned out that the attempt to make invisible ecosystem services visible can be surprising for many stakeholders. But the first question was that it was not easy to answer by colleagues in the different governments. Which government agency, which ministry is responsible for this comprehensive, broad ecosystem service valuation approach? Countries have national offices or departments for statistics, but very often they did not hold biological data or oceanographic data, for example. And the answer was that most countries felt that they did not have a national entity that had this task. And so, similar to the work of Migramar, very often NGOs, the academic sector, play a very important role to provide this function. Secondly, it was very common when we looked across all our 5 countries that values were underestimated. When we asked the colleagues in Fiji in the beginning, 15 years ago, which marine ecosystem service value they thought would be the most valuable for Fiji, the clear and direct answer was offshore fisheries, tuna fisheries, licenses to offshore fishing nations. That's the clear value. And if you saw at the time the Department of Fisheries, it was strongly dominated by offshore fisheries. So when we said, okay, how important and valuable is subsistence fishing in regard to the tuna fishery? Colleagues felt that would be 10%. And if you look now at the graph on the right side, you see the small black bubble, offshore tuna fisheries, cleaning up all the data, net value, 20 million Fiji dollars a year, and almost 6 times larger, the artisanal and subsistence fishing value. When we asked colleagues, what is the value of carbon storage? Nobody had an idea. We had no idea ourselves. 150 million nearly Fiji dollars per year. But when we asked colleagues in the fisheries department, how big do you think is the tourism value? They had no idea. And they also undervalued it in the sense that they said, of course, the tuna value is much larger because we see it. It's part of the GDP, and we can actually tangibly assess it every year. But the truth was that the marine tourism sector with 1.15 billion Fiji dollars was much, much larger. And even just the tourists who come to Fiji to see sharks underwater, even that value for the shark tourism is 4 times more than the tuna fisheries value, leading to a total value for Fiji of 2.5 billion Fiji dollars a year. Nobody expected that. And in that regard, the third bullet point was important. I think an important take-home message. Once those values were communicated, suddenly there were new stakeholders. It was the president's office that called. It was the Ministry of Economy. It was the Ministry of Mineral Resources that suddenly wanted to be involved in the process. And the common understanding of the different values of the different sectors created a much stronger incentives for every ministry to send senior staff to the national level consultation meetings and also to the planning meetings, because suddenly people realized what kind of natural capital the countries were really possessing. And I finish my slides here by just giving you a taste of how powerful maps can be, similar again to the maps that Cesar showed. 2010, 2011, when we looked at marine priority areas for conservation in Fiji, for example, a lot of the existing protected areas and a lot of the hotspot areas were coastal. And the majority of the EEZ was basically blue, a little bit in the unknown, so to say. And after we did the same, compiling many different spatial data sets, physical data, biological data, chemical data, various use data, risk data, the situation looked like this for Fiji. And this highlights just some of the more important forms of use, highlighting the pelagic fishery harvest at different times of the year, vessel traffic, deep sea resources, in some cases even waste disposal areas, and in a growing sense also, for example, the importance of the laying of submarine cables. So now with the last slides, taking a step beyond the boundaries. Very similar again to the Miramar approach, the question was, if governments do not only want to protect 11% of marine areas towards the Aichi targets, to Aichi target 11, if they do not, if they want to make sure that they conserve a representative network of MPAs, which areas should be included to make it truly representative? And we looked at Australia's example. Australia undertook a very complex biogenerization approach more than 10 years ago. And we wondered whether we could apply that approach to the EEZ of our countries. And this is what we saw. And that again highlights very much and underlines what Cesar presented. The blue areas offshore are not just blue, and then are not the same at all. When we looked at these different values, we found that in order for the government to identify representative sets of marine protected areas offshore, these different bioregional areas would need to be taken into account. And since we talked today about transboundary planning, this is how the picture looks if you, in this case, go beyond the EEZ of Vanuatu. So we carried out this bioregionalization approach not only within EEZ boundaries, but also beyond EEZ boundaries. And you see New Caledonia on the lower left. And a lot of these discussions and consultations have been leading, on one hand, also to higher level political discussions. You may have heard in Nice that the Melanesian countries have a vision of a transboundary oceanscape. At the same time, it is important that on the national level, the marine spatial planning is a strong foundation for the national forms of marine management. And that brings me to the last slide. We felt, looking at this process, that visible values were enormously powerful. People who recognized those values, politicians, private sector colleagues who could put a monetary value to an ecosystem service or an ecosystem good, were more willing to engage and also contribute to holistic national marine spatial planning. And once people became familiar with it, once it was not just abstract, marine spatial planning really changed the situation. At the same time, we had a lot of stakeholders who said, okay, we are working on a marine spatial plan and then it's done. And of course, that's not the case. No spatial plan is final, as we wrote here, because the context just keeps changing, as we all know. On one hand, social and natural sciences continue to contribute new knowledge. We are focusing more and more on monitoring and evaluation to make sure that our marine resource management, our marine protected areas are fulfilling our expectations. We will talk about the IUCN Green List at some stage. So in addition to MEET, MET, EVICA, and other tools to measure protected area effectiveness, from an inclusive and integrated marine spatial planning perspective, it should be 100% management up to the exclusive economic zone, and that should be effective from the perspective of the national governments and also the NGOs in the countries. We have seen the technology improves. Again, it's very nice that César presented before, because I think he could very nicely show how technology can really help. But that is only the case if the resulting data are accessible and can be shared in a format with different government stakeholders that they can utilize from their own perspective. At the same time, social, economic, political conditions keep changing. And my last message really is to all of us, because we are here mostly conservation practitioners. While we often ourselves get into marine spatial planning because we come from a conservation perspective, it is really important not to introduce marine spatial planning as a tool mainly or even only for conservation planning. Because if that is the case, we often lose the trust of other very important stakeholders in the process. So while we in MUKBio carried out the work we did to contribute to national networks of representative marine protected areas, and therefore they were a key outcome of marine spatial planning, I'm most impressed by the holistic processes that took place in these 5 countries. And I was just told a couple of days ago that in a current conference of Pacific Island states, some of the countries highlighted that those marine spatial planning efforts really assisted them to balance their social and economic development with their commitments on the global level to nature conservation. With that, back to you, Olivier. Thank you.